And it's actually crazy that I've only lived in COVID zero conditions. Okay, a lot of people have asked me what has it been like moving to Shanghai in 2022, or like why did I want to move to Shanghai in 2022. So for context, I lived in China between 2017 to the beginning of 2020, and I went back to Australia where I was born and raised. I'm obviously Chinese by ethnicity, and I'm proud to be Chinese, but I was born and raised in Australia and moved to Shanghai in 2017, was here until 2020, went back to Australia to do visa stuff because you can't have dual citizenship. I'm an Australian citizen. And that's when the pandemic started in 2020. I was told or advised to not come back to China until things settled down. I went to LA for a few months, planned to go from LA to Shanghai. Then the borders closed in China. I remember waking up in LA and my phone, I had all these WeChat messages from my friends being like, get on a plane right now, the borders are closing. And I calculated that with the time difference between LA and Shanghai, even if I got on a plane like that second, I would not make it back in time. Like the borders would already be closed. Same day, March 28th, 2020, the borders in Australia closed. Obviously, because I'm an Australian citizen, it would be easier for me to enter Australia. I didn't have the requisite paperwork to enter China. So I went back to my hometown, Perth, Western Australia, and I was there until May 2022 when I left to come back to China. And it's actually crazy that I've only lived in COVID zero conditions pretty much, other than like the 2 months that I was in LA where COVID started to spread there. And I guess they did have lockdown, but not COVID zero. When I was on my way to Australia, China had already enforced hotel quarantine. So I'd seen like information about hotel quarantine in China, and I just felt like Australia was probably going to try to replicate that kind of system. So I was like prepared for hotel quarantine, but around like the beginning of April 2020, they just hadn't really figured their shit out in Australia yet. So it was very like, I didn't know how long I would have to quarantine for. I quarantined in a like transit city because I flew from LA to Brisbane and then Brisbane to Perth, but I was made to quarantine in Brisbane for 2 weeks. And then at that time, Australia was kind of figuring out their COVID approach. So all of the flights in Australia were grounded and I didn't know when I could go back to Perth. So I had to live in Brisbane for like a week and a bit and then fly from Brisbane to Melbourne to Perth. And then I stayed in Perth from April, May 2020 until April, May 2022. Did not get on a plane for those 2 years, didn't really travel or go anywhere or do anything. I mean, I was working from home and I was spending a lot of time with my mom, and I started a podcast called Friend Crush you can listen to, but now I'm just going to do video format content, I think. And what a crazy time. I want to preface this by saying, like, at no point do I want anyone to feel sorry for me, because I am so hyper aware of like how lucky I am and the privileges that I have had to like cushion me from the emotional turmoil, distress and trauma that the last few years have had on me. And I think it's also a privilege to have had the space and time to like process all of that and then make conscious and intentional decisions about what I want to do. So I had an opportunity to apply for a visa around the end of December, beginning of January 2022. Because of like some personal family stuff, I was able to apply for a humanitarian visa to enter China. That was a whole thing. And honestly, I felt like there was going to be a lockdown in China before I came back, only because of my experience in Western Australia, which like their COVID policy has been compared to Chinese COVID policy. When people were talking about COVID zero management globally, they would literally talk about Western Australia as a state specifically and then China. So the thing with like COVID zero policy is that it obviously requires a lot of manpower and discipline on the part of the people that are working in these systems to be extremely careful with the way that they handle people that are traveling, incoming, treating people that have COVID, and just like ensuring that they're not creating an environment where it's possible for COVID to spread. And you have to be really careful. And I think that just the nature of systems in general, it's like it requires so much effort on the part of people that are in these systems. And at some point, like human error is going to occur. So when I was in Western Australia, we would have occasional outbreaks because a security guard at a hotel that at a quarantine hotel might have been like a little bit careless, or, you know, someone that was like positive was in the community, and then it caused like a mini outbreak. So I don't know why there was like a part of me that was like, I just feel like before I go back to Shanghai, there's going to be a lockdown in China, because they had already been operating for 2 years for the most part since the initial outbreak in 2020, where people were able to kind of like live normally in a way, in the sense that there wasn't widespread COVID infections in China. My friends in Shanghai were all working, able to socialize. They didn't have to wear masks until around 2022, I think. Don't quote me on that. But, you know, while the rest of the world was on fire from 2020, 2021, the people that I knew in China, which is obviously a very small percentage of a huge country, like they were living a totally different life. And I was still doing creative consulting for companies and brands. And they would ask me how they could connect with the Chinese market, because they recognized that it was the only place where people were able to kind of like live normally, and there was like still spending and buying power. So a part of me was like, I think there's going to be a lockdown, because the system and the amount of manpower and amount of discipline required to maintain zero COVID in a city like Shanghai. Shanghai is a mega city. The population of Shanghai is greater than the population of the whole of Australia. I don't think a regular person can actually imagine that, the amount of people involved, the amount of precautions required. And I just feel like there would be a point where human error occurs and a case gets through, an outbreak occurs. So this happened around April, I think, March, April, when they started to have cases and outbreaks in Shanghai, and then people had to start wearing masks here, and there was talk of lockdown. So at the time I was still in Australia, and the visa that I had eventually been granted, it had like a time period on it. So if I didn't enter China by a certain date in May, then that visa would expire, and there was like no hope of me applying for a new one. They basically told me, like, if you don't enter China by May, I think it was like May 22nd, then we can't help you, babe, okay? And I didn't have I kind of had other options to apply for a visa, but at the same time, it was just like, this was my best chance at the time. And then also a lot of flights get cancelled to China, because they have this policy where if they had a certain number of infections in a flight after landing, they would cancel that flight route, that flight path, for like 2 weeks. And then you'd have to wait for another flight. So my original flight was in April, and then that flight got cancelled and then rescheduled until May, beginning of May. And it was just a lot for me to process at the time, like, because I had waited for so long to come back to Shanghai. Like, when I was living in Shanghai between 2017 and 2020, beginning of 2020, like, I had built my post-university life in Shanghai, because I graduated from university in Perth from my law degree, my arts degree, and I left like within a week after my graduation ceremony, which my mum insisted that I attend. I otherwise wouldn't have bothered. I was like, okay, let's book a flight. Goodbye. So my work experience, my adult friendships were all formed when I was in Shanghai. And it was like so devastating for me to be in Perth and not know when I'd be able to come back. And no part of me wanted to live anywhere else but Shanghai. But eventually I was able to like release the yearning that I had for Shanghai, like the desperate yearning I initially had, and focus on being present in Perth, focus on being able to spend time with my mom. Like that was the longest amount of time that I've spent with my mom ever, because when I was younger, she was working a lot. We didn't spend much time together. And when I lived in Shanghai, she had business in China, but also I didn't feel like I was spending that much time with her. So both of us were able to be there and support each other through the things that we both personally were processing in that time, which is like really important to me, was very valuable to her as well. And I think that's what has taught me to appreciate all the different phases in your life. There's no way that I could have continued living the way that I did in Shanghai if I had just stayed. I would have had to change my approach to how I live here too. So it's not like I expect the experience that I had in Shanghai between 2017 and 2020 to be replicated now, or to have been replicated in Perth. But I think at first, a part of me was like, it's my fault that I can't do what I could do in Shanghai here. And I remember I had a therapist and she was like, but you're not there. You're not in Shanghai. You're in Perth. They're two totally different places. Of course, it's going to be difficult for you to work in the same capacity that you're used to live in the same way, to have the same lifestyle, because they're two different places and you have different people here, you have different opportunities here. And that took me a really long time to just process and accept. I think probably between April 2020 to like October 2020, that's how long it took me to like actually be consistent in some kind of like self-care routine, ritual, then like slowly figure out things that I could do with my time in Perth, as I'm sure a lot of people relate to like throughout this whole pandemic ordeal. So learning to just be patient with yourself as you adjust to new circumstances. It took me that long to just adjust to living in Perth. The lifestyle is so different. The environment is so different. COVID as well, restrictions as well. And when I look back, I think 2021 was like one of the most peaceful years of my life. Like I have hardly any like digital record, I feel, of 2021 on like my Instagram grid. And I don't remember any like major highs or like major lows from that year. I think it was just like a very peaceful year for me, which I'm grateful for, sandwiched in between 2020 and 2022 that have just been like so emotionally chaotic and taxing. So yeah, I miss 2021 in some ways, but also grateful to have been able to like move on from that chapter. So 2022, yeah, my flight got postponed to May. And this is like, by this point in my journey, I've just learnt to, or like I try to remind myself to trust in like divine timing and to just like believe that things will unfold the way that they need to unfold, rather than overly attaching to my emotions, especially my anxiety or my fear around certain things. Because ultimately, and I mention this a lot in my podcast and I will continue to mention it in future videos, it's like you have an idea of your ideal self, or like the person that you want to be, the life you want to live. And in moments of emotional overwhelm, I think it's important to recenter yourself and then consider who that person is, what that image is, and how you can make intentional decisions in those moments that are in service of that like ideal higher self, right? I can make an anxious decision, response, reaction that is going to be, in response to my anxious self, a low vibrational state. Or I can process, allow that emotion, think about the higher version of myself I want to be, and try to make a decision in service of that version of me. So many moments where this was occurring for me, like my flight getting postponed, and then also just like the lockdown situation in Shanghai was so hectic. Like I will never ever claim to know what it's like to go through what people in Shanghai and China have been through in terms of like really intense lockdowns, like not being allowed to like leave your apartment building, worrying about food shortages. Like eventually people were able to like find solutions around food shortages, but that's not necessarily the case for everyone. A lot of people have been very adversely affected by these lockdowns, the same way that people like in Melbourne in Australia would have been affected by lockdowns too. So I don't want to minimize or make an assumption about what that would be like, because I like can't imagine it. It's just something that you have to actually go through. But at the time, the lockdowns here were getting really hectic. I was still staying in contact with my friends here. And I still wanted to come back to Shanghai. Like, I always believed that, you know, things happen like this. You like spiral up and spiral down, and things are changing all the time. And even after like a really fucked up time, there's always an upturn, whether it's economically, whether it's emotionally, spiritually. Like, you can't expect things to exponentially grow or decay. There is always like opportunity for rebirth, in my opinion. So I just had faith that it was going to be okay eventually. I just didn't know when that was going to be and if I would be able to make it. So my flight got postponed, and then the lockdown was getting worse. And then I think I started to worry about whether I would be able to enter Shanghai, because at that point there would have been like quarantine facilities at capacity, probably no hotel quarantines, and it's just difficult to predict what the government would decide at any point, because the circumstances were constantly changing, so then the response was always changing too. And I remember like calling my travel agent and asking them like, should I reroute to a different city, enter from a different city? And we looked at Guangzhou because they hadn't had an outbreak at that time, or it wasn't as bad. And he told me like how much it would cost, and I was like, okay, I've already spent enough money on this, so I'm just gonna wing it and see what happens. And then the next day he called me and was like, okay, just letting you know, your flight to Shanghai is going to be rerouted to Kunming in Yunnan, southern China, and you're going to quarantine from there instead of Shanghai. So I was like, okay, that's crazy. Glad I made a decision from a place. Like, my anxious self would have jumped at the opportunity to change my flight, but at the same time I was like, okay, I don't want to spend more money on this. I just have to trust that like whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And I had also tried to mentally prepare myself for like every possible outcome. Like, based on my experience in 2020, I did not anticipate that I would be living in Perth for 2 years. Like, a part of me at first was like, oh, I'll be here for like 2 or 3 months and I can go back to Shanghai. And that was not the case. So I was thinking like, okay, I need to fly from Perth to Sydney, Sydney to Shanghai, which then became Kunming. I could test positive at Sydney airport and then be turned back and have to live in Perth. I might test positive for COVID before I even make it to my flight, not even be able to leave. I might get to Shanghai and the lockdown would be fucked. I might get sent to like a quarantine facility that's not a quarantine hotel. I might be, God knows, like I might hate being in Shanghai when I get back. I just tried to mentally prepare myself for all different outcomes, but ultimately I was like, I just want to go back to Shanghai. Yeah, there was a lot of requirements to enter China in terms of like COVID, previous infection history, and then also your testing before getting on the plane. And it's crazy how expensive it costs to get a nucleic test in Australia. Like, I probably spent $200 plus on like 2 nucleic tests and an antibody test. And then when I was at Sydney airport, I spent 60 or 70 Australian dollars getting a rapid test with a phone email report that I was negative, because all the tests that I've done in China have been free, except for maybe 2 that I paid for in Kunming with a report that were like 28 RMB, like $5, $6. So my flight from Perth to Sydney was great, hot food, etc. Got to Sydney airport, people weren't really wearing masks. People at the flight counters not wearing masks until I got to China Eastern. I think that's the airline that I flew. Masks plus people in full hazmat taking temperatures, checking your COVID test history. I didn't read the fine print on my flight information, but like no hot food was going to be served on my flight. I literally thought I was going to die of starvation, and I didn't prepare myself by like buying snacks or anything at the airport. They gave you like 2 dry snack boxes with like a packaged muffin and like biscuits and yogurt or something. That's what I lived off. And I think it was like a 12 or 13-hour flight. Landed in Kunming. It's crazy because the flight path also was said that it was still Sydney to Shanghai. Like there was no official record that I was flying into Kunming except like a little sheet of paper I got given at the desk that was like, hey, you're going to be going to Kunming. Scan this code and input your details. So I flew to Kunming. I also had to mentally prepare myself for hotel quarantine. The standard at the time was 2 weeks, but I'd also heard of some people having to do 3 weeks, other people maybe like 4 weeks. So I was like, okay, I'm probably going to have to quarantine for up to a month. Like that's what I need to mentally prepare myself for. And I had like a suitcase of summer clothes because it was May. I was going into summer, leaving summer in Australia for summer in China. A suitcase of like summer clothing, and then another suitcase that was filled with like food and snacks, yoga mat, shit to keep me entertained while I was in quarantine. And then landed in Kunming. A lot of testing at the airport, spraying down of all of your stuff. They had quite an efficient testing system at the airport, I'm not gonna lie. The airport was completely dead. Transferred to a quarantine hotel. The lady in front of me was like asking about taofang, and I was like, taofang, what's that? Like, oh, like rather than like a studio room, like a hotel room where your bedroom is separate. And I was like, oh my God, she is a genius. And then we were asking like, how long do we have to quarantine for? And they were like, 3个星期, 3 weeks. So I was like, okay. I was hoping for 2. I was prepared for a month. 3 weeks, I can deal with. And the price of like a bigger room wasn't that much more, or it was like doable for me. So I was like, okay, fuck it, just take my money. I would rather a bigger space for 3 weeks than like just being depressed in a small space. So I managed to get a bigger room, quarantined for 3 weeks. It wasn't as bad as the 2 weeks that I did in Brisbane on my way in from the States, because I had like mentally prepared myself for it. And I knew that I was like going somewhere that I wanted to go. Like my final stop was going to be Shanghai. That's where I'd wanted to return to. When I was flying from LA to Australia, Brisbane, quarantining in Brisbane, I knew my final stop was going to be Perth, and I didn't want to go back to Perth. And then just like the circumstances at the time were like very up and down, all the other shit I was dealing with in my personal life, professional life, my life literally just blowing up in my face. I was like, okay, that was much harder on me emotionally and mentally, even though it was only 2 weeks, than the 3 weeks that I did in Kunming. And I remember like when I was like day 8 in my hotel quarantine in Brisbane, nobody had checked in on me. Nobody had like done a temperature test or a COVID test at all. I was like, I could literally be dead and they wouldn't know. They would just know from like the accumulation of food outside of my hotel room. And someone from the Red Cross like called and was like, hi, I'm Sue from the Red Cross. Just checking in to see how you're doing mentally. And like the 8th day of that quarantine was so tough. Like you just get past the halfway mark. I was like looking out at the balcony window thinking like, should I just like climb down? Should I just jump off? Like, what the fuck am I doing here? Dark times. Anyway, Kunming was different. I was able to just like manage mentally. A part of me had always wanted to go to Yunnan anyway, and I used to really like Yunnan food when I was in Shanghai. I'd never been. So I was excited to get out of quarantine and then maybe like explore the city. Because I didn't know when I could go back to Shanghai, because Shanghai was still in lockdown, and they kept kind of like changing and postponing the date. So finished quarantine. It just so happened that like an internet friend, saw that I'd posted I was in Kunming. She's from Kunming, but she lives in Canada. And she was like, oh my God, my friend is also quarantining in Kunming. And then connected me to them on WeChat. They had flown from Melbourne to Sydney, Sydney to Kunming on the same flight. And we were getting out on the same day. So we decided to meet up later. Still in contact with them to this day in Shanghai. So I finished quarantine. I had like a distant family relative that was a similar age to me. My mum connected me to them. They live in Kunming and they picked me up and they were like, let me take you out for dinner with my friends. It just started to go downhill from here. Like we had local Yunnan cuisine, which is like spicy and also oily. And just for me, after living in Perth for 2 years, my whole diet and lifestyle had changed to just like happen to be very clean. I still like ate junk food and whatever, but nothing like Yunnan cuisine. You know, I would have like hot chips and like sandwiches, and I wasn't eating much spicy food at all. My mom doesn't eat spicy. You know, the Chinese food I would have would all be very like Hong Kong style, not spicy at all. Yeah, like soy cappuccino. It's not hectic by any means on the digestive system, at least for me. So spicy, oily Yunnan food plus Baijil, which is like 60 proof alcohol. That was, maybe it was Huangjiu, I don't know, but whatever it was, it came in a bamboo bottle. It was being poured into little jugs, which was then poured into little shot glasses. And I'm really not a big drinker at all. But, you know, it's kind of like rude not to in China when you're in these like family and business settings and people are drinking. So they were like, 美女, like, 欢迎到昆明, la la la, like shots. So yeah, after that I got food poisoning, not slay. I was literally dying. I think it took me like a few days to just sort of like recover from that experience. And then I went out of the next hotel that I was staying in and bought like dumplings or something, got food poisoning again, started spewing. I remembered this like Yunnan style restaurant chain that was in Shanghai that had really great chicken soup. So I was like looking for that restaurant to see if they had one in Kunming. They did, but it was really far from my hotel. But you can like pay extra to get a driver to go and pick it up and deliver it to you. And extra, I mean like instead of paying or like not even paying for delivery because it might be included in your usual takeaway delivery or like 6 RMB, you might pay like 15 or 20. So I got this huge chicken soup delivered to my hotel and was like living off that for a day. Eventually, I was able to leave Kunming. I had to reschedule my flight. And I made it to Shanghai. When I got to Shanghai, that was when they just started to open up. So for me, that was like divine timing. I left while they were in lockdown, but by the time I had finished quarantine, the city had started to open up, flights started to become available. I was able to fly in early June. So early June, there was still restrictions in Shanghai, but people were allowed, like stores were starting to open, but you weren't able to dine in and you were expected to get COVID tests like semi-regularly. They had all these like little booths that were on the street that you can walk into and do a free swab test and you mouth swab. I think some do nose, but I haven't had a nose one. I had a friend that was like, I thought I was getting a throat swab, but they did a nose swab. And it's connected to like your Alipay or your WeChat. You scan a QR code, you do the test, and then keep it moving. So yeah, no dine-in, no clubs. But for me, it was already like an upgrade. I mean, I think as I was leaving Perth that week, they'd already started opening up at the beginning of 2022, but the week of May that I was leaving or end of April, that's when they lifted the mask mandate. And people around me had already started to get COVID, and I had to be really careful because at the time, if you caught COVID and you wanted to fly into China, you needed like 2 weeks after your recovery, proof that you'd spent 2 weeks after your recovery or whatever. I don't even remember what it was, but I was just like, okay, no COVID for me. I don't want COVID. So I was like getting asked to DJ things. I had to say no because no. If I DJ'd and people in the club had COVID, I would get COVID. My life would be over. It was so difficult for me to say no because there were gigs that I really wanted to play. There were things I wanted to do, but I just had to keep thinking about how I wanted to go back to Shanghai, how I'd waited like 2 years for this opportunity. So I was like, okay, fuck. I just have to be responsible. Even when the mask mandate was lifted, I was still wearing a mask to the grocery store to buy the stuff for my quarantine. When I got to Shanghai, like club closures, restaurant closures, that was already like normalized for me. I'd been used to that after 2 years in Perth. Obviously, our restrictions and our lockdowns were nowhere near like what happened in Shanghai. But, this whole thing of like, oh, you get booked for an event, the event gets cancelled or rescheduled, that was normal. Having one case closing the city down, that was normal. Only being able to go to the grocery store, that was normal. It was really whatever for me. Like, an inconvenience at best for me, but I still consider myself like very lucky in the face of these circumstances. I think within a month of me coming back, they started to allow dine-in at restaurants, and then maybe 2 months clubs were able to open, but there would be like small outbreaks here and there. So a club might have to close, events get rescheduled, but then that club would be able to reopen, and then another club might have an outbreak because the city is just like so huge that they don't close the whole. It's like lots of little cities within one, and Shanghai is not like a province. It's like a province and a city in one. So like they kind of do it by district when they do lockdowns, in order to sort of have this like dynamic COVID zero situation. So at this point, what is it now? Beginning of December, I think in spite of the restrictions, there's been club events, there's been brand events, there's been exhibitions, you can eat out, like there's still a lot you can do. You can travel domestically. It can be like a bit of a nuisance if like the other city has issues, but for me, I was in Western Australia for 2 years. I didn't travel to Sydney or Melbourne. My friends that wanted to come from Sydney or Melbourne never made it. Like I had DJ friends in Sydney and Melbourne that would be like, oh, I'm going to play a gig in Perth, like see you next month. All of those gigs were cancelled basically. I think only the people who were coming back to see their family already from Western Australia but lived in the eastern states, those friends I saw, but it was very difficult to travel domestically in Australia between 2020 and 2022. So within China, I think I have been to Hangzhou for a shoot and to Chengdu for a gig from Shanghai. And I've just been so lucky. Like when I was in Hangzhou, my apartment building in Shanghai went into a 2-day lockdown. And by the time I got back from Hangzhou, I think I got back at like midnight. I just needed to stay inside for like 8 hours the next day. Oh no, until the end of the next day. So it was like a day of lockdown, not even a full day of lockdown for me by the time I got back from that trip. And then when I came back from Chengdu, that's when they enforced this like health code thing where if you returned from an outside city, you need to do health monitoring for like 5 days. And I think my friend and I got back to Shanghai like the day before they had that enforced. Or like it would come up with a pop-up on my code, but you would just like click OK and it would go away. But then after that, when people came in, it would have like this red text underneath it, which would make it more difficult to go into certain venues. So I've just been very, very lucky. Divine timing is real. You need to believe in it. Because before I went to Chengdu recently, November, they started to have some cases. And so my friend and I were like, should we go? Shouldn't we go? Okay, let's just see what happens. Like if we get locked down, we get locked down. Fuck it. Like whatever. My mom calling me from Australia being like, don't go anywhere. You're going to get taken away. It was all good. I had a great time in Chengdu. I'm going to have a video recap of that trip soon with the pandas and all the chili. But yeah, I've just been really lucky. It was so overwhelming at first when I came back. I think 6 months, it's been almost 6 months. I feel kind of like I'm in some kind of groove, at least. I've just accepted that like shit is changing all the time. And, from the type of work that I do, it's very unstable. And I just do my best and roll with the punches. I know how lucky I am. And I think that in terms of like culture shock, the city has changed. Obviously the energy is very different. It was very like, and when I first got back, I could tell that people were just like so dejected and so exhausted from what they just experienced from the lockdown, which I totally I mean, I don't like understand, but I can accept and acknowledge. And I think that based on my experience in Australia with COVID and with lockdowns and just the mental and emotional toll that it can take on you, I can't even imagine what people need to process here. And everybody is just going to be different in how if they even do process those things, because you don't actually realize the way that you've been kicked into survival mode sometimes. So yeah, but then I've also just seen like the resilience of people here as well, their ability to go from an experience like that and just like pick up the pieces, do their best and keep moving. So I'm just very grateful to be back. I didn't expect to come back to the same city by any means. And I think that even if I was here, the city would change. Even if there was no pandemic, the city would change. Shanghai changed a lot. When I was here in the two and a bit years that I was here, there were a lot of changes that happened. It is really a city that moves very quickly. And I think that when I was in Perth, I underwent a lot of like personal, emotional, mental, spiritual change, because it was an opportunity for me to just heal a lot of the trauma that I had around growing up in Perth, which I wouldn't have been able to have time to process if I had just been living the way I was living pre-pandemic in Shanghai. Because looking back, I can see that a part of me was like running from myself in the way that I was like living at the time. So the practices that I had and what I learnt from being in Perth, I brought with me to Shanghai, and they have helped me to like ground myself in the process of being so overwhelmed coming back, and just like the number of things that I need to get used to and just reacclimatize to, because it was like a come down for me to go from living in a really big city to living in a really small, I don't know if you would call it a city. And it took me time to adjust to that. Just like going from being so stimulated to not stimulated. Like I think I just stared at the horizon for like 2 years basically, when I was in Perth. And then coming from Perth to Shanghai, that was a huge adjustment, just from being in this kind of like peaceful suburban area near the ocean to just like mega city, so many people, so much more social interaction. Like when I was in Perth, I would see maybe one friend a week, sometimes no friends. It was just me, my mum and my dog, and me going to the post office, shipping Depop orders, me going to the cafe next to the post office to get a coffee, working remotely, like talking to the few people on the team that I was working with, and then some other projects in like other time zones and stuff. And then like being in a WeChat group chat with like my friends that were still in Shanghai. Yeah. And then coming to Shanghai and just like within the first week of being back, I saw so many people. I was like, I think I've like had more social interaction in this week than I have in a whole year. And I think I only DJ'd like a handful of times over 2 years when I was in Perth. I think within the first few months, I already played more gigs here than I did in a year in Perth. And that's like Shanghai with restrictions. So for me, my experience is just so different to a lot of people who have been here through the first 2 years of the pandemic, because they were able to go out regularly without testing, without lockdowns, without masks. And then they experienced the period of restriction between April and June, or like March to June. So the way that the city is now is like a downgrade from the last 2 years for them. But for me, I already lived in restrictions for 2 years. So for me coming to Shanghai, even though it's restricted here, there's still more for me to do here than there was for me to do in Perth. So it's just like interesting how those like kind of opposite experiences like clash in a way and yeah, just like a lot of the conversations that I've had with people here, they're like, why would you come back to China? It's so fucked up right now. Like, what do you even see in this city? And I'm like, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so grateful that I made it back. I don't want to go anywhere else. Like a lot of people are planning travel because restrictions are easing. Like I did 21 days of hotel quarantine and now it's only 5 plus 3, like 8 days total. They say like 5 days in the hotel than 3 in your community or like in your own home. But I think most of the time they kind of make you end up doing 8 days total in a hotel. And I don't want to do any quarantine if I'm going to be traveling. And I'm like just more than happy to stay in Shanghai or in China for the next few months at least. But that's because for me, I was in Perth for 2 years. I couldn't go anywhere. So me leaving was me coming to Shanghai. And for people that are here, they've been here for 2 years and they need to leave and go somewhere else and get fresh perspective, or they need to leave the country completely. Like a lot of people I've heard have left Shanghai or moved out of Shanghai, but most of those people had already done like really long stints here. And I think that I remember when I first moved, a lot of people would tell me that this is a very transitory city, like not many people stay and settle down here, which I totally understand because it's like so fast paced, high pressure. Eventually you get to a stage in your life where you want to settle down and you might want to start a family. It would be very expensive and difficult to do that here and not for everybody. So I don't think that that is a bad thing about the city. It just depends like what you want for yourself. Different people are at different stages in their lives. So some people want to be here and enjoy this environment and other people don't. For me, I consider myself very lucky that I have connection to somewhere like Perth, where it's like very clean, slow paced. I have great friends there. My family is there. And I have a home to go to if I ever want to. At the same time, I also consider myself very lucky to have a completely opposite experience of that, which is living in a really big city, international city, that's just like very fast paced, technology, convenience. I've just been living with zero COVID for the last 3 years. I had a Western experience of it while I was in Australia, and I had a Chinese experience of it being in Shanghai. And for me, like I can understand that doing PCR tests like every other day or every day is such an inconvenience for people here, especially if you have an office job and you have to work this into your schedule. For me, because I'm freelance, I can just go down and do a COVID test whenever. Sometimes I've forgotten. I haven't gotten to like a yellow code yet, but I would take a COVID test every day if it meant that I could stay in Shanghai. Like I don't want to go anywhere else. The way that I was like in Perth and I just knew that I was going to leave eventually. In Shanghai right now, I'm like, I'm good just like hanging out here. If the opportunity comes to go somewhere, of course I'll take it, but I'm not in a rush to leave because I feel like I just got here. Like it's crazy how quickly time passes because in some ways I feel like I just got here. But in other ways, I feel like I've lived like 3 years worth of life in Perth in 6 months, 5 months since I've been back. So yeah, that's me living with COVID zero. I think the country or like the city is opening soon, hoping for 2023. But we'll see. I just roll with the punches now, honestly. Like focus on what you can control. Focus on the things that you can be grateful for. Like what I learned is that it doesn't matter how much energy you spend being anxious or like trying to control something out of your control. It doesn't actually make it within your control, So better that you just embrace, try to live in the moment, figure out who your higher self is and make decisions in service of them rather than from your anxiety. Easier said than done, of course, and it's not like that's just going to solve like structural issues within society, but at least it will make your subjective experience of the world more tolerable, and then you'll have more space to actually think about how you can contribute in a positive and productive way to other people's lives, right? When you've figured out your own shit, then you can support other people in their shit. You can't like have your shit all fucked up and then tell other people how to live their life and how you can help them. You don't even know what you're doing. So that's kind of been a really big takeaway for me over the last few years. And yeah, that's all I have to say on this topic. Thank you for listening. I'm Amber Akilla. You can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, SoundCloud, Spotify. I guess this is Friend Crush, at friend.crush on Instagram. And yeah, stay hydrated. Tell your friends and family that you love them. Go be a better person. I'll speak to you soon. Love you.